Ye all fetishes, sexual deviance throughout history. Now, this is a topic that interests me quite a bit because it's something so many people lie about. Perhaps lie by omission, but they still lie. They have a vested interest in making themselves appear in a way that is not true. And this is something I see all throughout human history. And the first person I can jump to is the Marquis de Sade. And this was the first book I read as an adult. When I was like 14 or 15, I read Philosophies of the Bedroom and Justine. And I remember thinking to myself, like, wow, this guy isn't lying. Like, finally, someone is telling the truth. And that was my impression of Sade, is that he wasn't lying. At least he's telling the truth. Graphic and gory and unpleasant as it might be, he was telling the truth. Now, Sade was around 1740. That's when he was born. I think he dies in like 1814 or 1816, something like that. He lived to be pretty old. And one of the main things, I shouldn't say main, but a point Sade hammers on a lot is how all the noblemen and all the clergy were all involved in these depraved and deviant sexual acts all the time. And they lied about it in public. And the peasantry was also often involved in sexual deviance. It has been in humans throughout human history. It is just something that most humans are too ashamed to talk about. Now, for better and worse, I do think humans should not go and lay it all out there just because people don't want to hear that. It's not something you want to shove into people's faces, in my opinion. It is something to best kept reserved. In this case, with myself, I am talking about it for very specific reasons. And as I have indicated before, I felt lied to my entire life. I felt like no one was ever telling me the truth. Even when they would go and say, I am telling you the absolute truth, they would still omit things that made them look bad. And this made me perceive a warped picture of reality because these people were too ashamed to acknowledge humanity for what it is. And this is what I try not to do. Like I said, I try not to shove things in people's faces. I try not to be graphic or obscene, but nevertheless address things as they actually are. So, if the Marquis sees it everywhere, now once again, he might be biased, then the next one I can jump to, and it's just one line in a play, but it is a very telling line, is from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Now, anyone who's read that play or seen it knows what I'm going to go to. I think it's like, what, 2-5, Act 2, Scene 5, something like that. Cleopatra is talking, and she says to one of her handmaidens or whatever, one of the women that hangs out with her and does stuff for her. She's talking about how enamored Marcus Aurelius is with her. Not Marcus, god damn it. Marcus Aurelius. Oh no. Anthony, I'm sorry. I was planning a line. Oh dear. Anyway, she's talking about Anthony and how enamored he is with her. And what she says is she's talking about one night when she got him drunk. She's like, I dressed him in my tires and mantles, meaning her clothes and like her jewelry, and I wore his sword. Now, his sword's name is like Philippine or something like that. But any way you slice that, it is still a reversal of sexual roles, right? There is, even if she is not talking about penetration, which in my opinion that's kind of what they're talking about, um, it is still role reversal. Um, there is kink to it, obviously. And if that's in Shakespeare, like well enough where it's part of the play, so even though the play is about, ancient Rome, it is still a product of Shakespeare's time. So one would imagine that people would have some connection to this. Now, I'm jumping around quite a bit here, and the next place I'm going to jump to is Freud. And I believe Freud and many of the people of Freud's day, especially the upper class, seem to have what I would designate an incest fetish. They all seem very into incest. And I don't mean just to explain his model of how the human mind works, which I think there are. I think it's hit and miss. But I do agree with a lot of stuff that comes out of Freud's mouth, and to the point where I will hear something and I'm like, I had that same idea. And in fact, one of the ways in which this is Freud says the reason infantile amnesia exists is because the sexual urges that exist in the mind when you are basically a baby, in animal urges, would be too confusing for a human to like compute. Now, when I first heard the idea of infantile amnesia, my response was it's because the thoughts are too terrible and what goes on is too horrible for the mind to process. And while I kind of mean that in a joking way, um, like in certain cases, it's obviously more true than others. If you experience a lot of upsetting things when you are a very young age and people treat you very badly, obviously your perception of the world will be very negative. Um, like it's not very far fetched, but I do think that there is a lot of stuff that will become sexuality present at that point, even. And I think Freud is a little too fixated on incest. Um, and I think the people of his day were a little too fixated on incest. There's a very famous line from a book. It's a psychology book, and it's about fathers and daughters. And it goes on to say that if a father basically sexually molests his daughter, it doesn't really do much harm and actually forms a closer bond between the father and the daughter. Now, obviously, this is not true, and it is a horrible and shattering thing of like trust and boundaries and all kinds of stuff. But at the time when that was written and psychology was still in its infancy, um, you could get away with saying crazy shit like that. And I think incest was a much more prevalent fetish. It is still very prevalent. In my experience, it is much more common to see in women than it is in men today. There is a certain type of guy that I see where I associate that personality with incest. And it's interesting because that personality does match up with a lot of the ways Freud and his upper class would behave. Very, very reserved. But I do think Freud was onto some things. And I think the modern way they have dismissed so many of his ideas. In fact, they've dismissed his idea about infantile amnesia entirely almost. And I think that goes too far. I think there is a portion of that that is true. But Freud had an incest fetish, and a lot of people that were around back then, incest fetishes were very, very normalized. And throughout history, at different points, they have been very, very normalized. I don't have them, so I don't really connect with it too much. Now, my next one is jumping back in history a little, but Edgar Allan Poe, I strongly suspect liked women's clothing a little too much. If you read his poetry, there is a lot of fixation on women's clothing. And at one point, I used to do phone sex, and the the guys that would call were all guys that were into getting cuckolded and dominated and humiliated, and that's why they would call, because they wanted to hear about their girlfriend being smashed or their wife or something like that, and they wanted to be humiliated in the process. I had no problem doing that, and I remember I was reading Poe's poetry at this time, and I had just gotten off a call, and I'm reading. I don't remember which poem it was, but I'm looking at it, and then I'm looking back at the phone, and like, these two things are very, very similar in ways. Now, I don't have anything beyond unsubstantiated speculation that Edgar Allan Poe was into women's clothing. Beyond, you can read it for yourself and judge whether a man should know that much about the frilly parts of women's clothes. You know, but this stuff is with humans all throughout human history. Human minds don't really change that much. It's the way it is. And however fixating on a thing or an idea helps people deal with upsetting things at a very, very young age, I don't know why it is that way, but it is that way. And as I have gotten older and my ability to read and understand humans has increased, it is also increasingly difficult for people to hide their predilections from me. In fact, just talking to a lot of people for 5 or 10 minutes, I've already formed a sexual profile of them. It's just a process my head does with a lot of other things, but there are ways in which people can't lie and don't lie. And I don't know why this is, but people always leave clues to their personality on them. Don't know why. I catch myself doing it. People leave clues as to their inner world, their truest self, all over the place. And you have to be able to pick up the patterns. And people want to be known, but they are ashamed at the same time. And this is something I will not let myself fall prey to. I believe it. I got this from King of the Hill, so it could be wrong. It was Bill's uncle or cousin, Gilbert, who says it. But what he says is, I believe it was Lucretius who said, "Nothing human disgusts me." And I have always quoted that. I don't even know if it's from Lucretius, who I have never been able to find a lot of information on. I know he wrote a lot, but a lot of his books were destroyed over the years. I believe parts of some do exist, and maybe one or two whole copies, but he was prolific. I don't want to say prolific because I was going to say prophylactic, and I already had the Marcus Aurelius mistake in this. But, oh no. But anyway, this is something that is in humans, and you can see it readily in a lot of Roman sources where they were more open about these things. But they were more open with violence as well, as to what it looked like. Because, like, as violent as stuff is in modern American culture, it does not match what it looks like. It's like a cartoon version of it. It is not what it is. And when I read the Iliad, a lot of that stuff, it it fits. At least the specific translation, which is the Fagel's translation, but the image of violence they paint is much closer to what actual violence looks like. And they tended to be more honest about their human traits. So I can tell you it's always present in humans. It's just humans always obscure it, omit it, or outright lie about it. And I try not to do that. Take it for what it's worth.